Everybody. Welcome to the session on evaluators and evaluations. This session is part, as you know, of the Office of Indian Education 2023 Project Director meeting. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this, there's sometimes a sound that plays, but I'll just read this. So this presentation was produced under the U.S. Department of Education, contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Incorporated. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or the policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. Okay, next slide. Hi, my name is Melissa Selden. I am the head of what we call the data team here at Synergy. I'm also an evaluation specialist and work with the Office of Indian Education, reviewing people's annual performance reports and conducting needs assessments. And I'm thrilled to be here today. Before we begin, I just want to, thank you. Before we begin, I just want to give a quick summary of my experience. Also to let you know that I'm originally from New York. So if I start to speak too quickly, just let me know. And B, we are going to be taking questions in between each major section as indicated by a blue slide. So if you have a question, please drop it either in the chat or in the Q&A box. And Capella, who's my partner in crime here today, will be able to help you get them answered. So just a quick summary of my background. I have over 20 years of experience working on evaluations and with evaluators on subject matters including K-12 education, healthcare, the justice systems, and higher education. I've been both evaluated as a program director and been the evaluator, and I'm thrilled to be here. So next slide. So today we're going to cover evaluation basics, just a few introductory thoughts about evaluation, Native American approaches to evaluation. We're going to go a little bit more in depth into logic models and evaluation plans. And then we're going to talk a little bit about using outside evaluators with your programs. So the next slide. So just a note on the terminology. First off, I just want to let you know is that we do have a source list. So if you're interested in any of the resources that I'm citing from, those are available and we can get them to you. Secondly, in this presentation, Indigenous and Native American, American Indian, and Alaskan Native refer to peoples with ancestral and cultural origins in many of the territories that now make up the United States. I acknowledge that these terminologies were not chosen by tribal communities and instead were based on settler colonial language. My hope is that evaluations of programs in each tribal nation will reflect their own tribe's experiences, context, and values. So, next slide. Evaluation basics. So we're going to start with a quick poll on the next slide. So, how many years of experience do you have with evaluation? Is the poll, there it is. Less than 1, this is all new. 1 to 5, I'm familiar but not an expert, or 5 or more, and you consider yourself an expert. Please take a minute and answer the poll. I'm not seeing the results. Capella, can you see the results?
I'm not able to yet.
I can read the results for you, Melissa.
That would be great. Thank you,
So,
Gordana.
of course, less than 1 is 17%. 1 to 5 is also 17%, and 5 or more is 67%.
Whoa, okay. So that's great. All right. So for some of you, this may be a little bit basic, but consider it a refresher. Because we don't know who's coming to the presentations before we write them, we erred on the side of having it be a little more basic and refresher oriented than diving really deep into different topics. However, feel free to ask any questions. I'm happy to answer them. So next slide, please. So what is evaluation? So evaluation is basically how you see if your program, project, or policy is working. Is it doing what it's meant to do? Are the people involved doing what they're supposed to do? Are the results similar to what you thought might happen? So you can use the information in this presentation in a number of ways. You can use it to help design your own evaluations. You can give this webinar to others to help them understand evaluation concepts, or you can use it to guide your interactions with a professional evaluator. So just a quick terminology note, we will be using the term intervention here interchangeably with activity, program, policy, personnel. The intervention is essentially what you are undertaking and to enact to create the change in the targeted audience. So this could be a reading curriculum, this could be math tutoring, this could be a therapist holding group sessions, it could be a whole variety of different things, but the intervention is the actions that is taking and that represents. So while it might sound a little bit clinical, it's really a catch-all description in this scenario. So hallmarks, next slide, please. So a well-run evaluation will answer critical questions such as, what is the need that the program or policy is filling? Who is the target audience, and are they being served? How is the program being implemented, and how well? Is the program having an impact? Obtaining answers to all of these questions is part and parcel of a quality evaluation. You may find out over the course of your evaluation that actually the people you were targeting in the intervention was not the right people. You may find that the program being implemented is either not being implemented correctly, or may just be a wrong choice for the community at large. So what the advantage of having evaluation is that you obtain points of reflection within the course of the program. So next slide, please. So evaluations work best when they're begun during the project's conception. To begin your project, some of you may have conducted a formal needs assessment or had conversations with tribal elders, held a talking circle, or some combination thereof. All of these efforts are part of the question asking phase. The subsequent three phases of an evaluation: organizing the evaluation, creating goals and benchmarks, and designing measurements or indicators, come out of the first phase, out of the answers to your questions. Carrying out the evaluation and reporting results will lead to asking additional questions about why things work the way that they did. Evaluation is not intended to be linear, or rather, should not be operated on as a linear method. Evaluation is intended to be circular. Getting answers to questions will raise answers to new questions, and hopefully continuation, so on and so on, each year of your evaluation. the act, and this can be represented by the reporting of results, right? So when you report your result to your stakeholders, whoever they may be, these can highlight areas for improvement in the program. They can also highlight setbacks in the evaluation and create plans to ameliorate those setbacks. All of those should lead to more questions that you could be asking. So next slide, please. When you talk about different types of evaluation, you're talking about essentially three big groups. You're talking about a formative evaluation, where you're looking at, does the intervention fit the program? Is the target the right target? For example, I work closely with one of our other groups, and we design media campaigns on underage alcohol use and mental health. And so we're often talking to groups of teens to see, does that 30-second public service announcement speak to you? Are we capturing your thoughts, your views? Will it change your interactions around these subjects? Does the PSA fit the program? Process. So process evaluations are really what you're looking at with the people who are giving the intervention. Is the intervention implemented correctly? Do the people involved have enough support to be successful? I'm sure many of us have experienced that situation where your elementary school all of a sudden changes how they're teaching reading and have a new curriculum, but maybe the teachers haven't completed all the professional development around the new curriculum. So the new curriculum cannot be implemented successfully, or maybe could be implemented partially successfully. This is an example of something that would come up during a process evaluation. And then finally, outcome evaluations. And this is what most people think of when you think of an evaluation, is the outcome. Did the intervention do as it was supposed to do? Did it raise reading scores? Did it raise math scores? Do kids feel like they belong more? Are they graduating high school at higher rates? All of those things we hope we can show are a result of the intervention that we perform. Typically, it's the intervention plus a lot of other factors, and a good evaluation would take into account all of those factors. So, next slide. So here is an example of an evaluation model or a logic model. You may have seen, I'm sure you guys have seen these before. It's fairly linear. It seems like everything, once you got your inputs, then you do your activities, you'll get your outputs, and that'll automatically lead to the short-term outcomes. For those of you who have been involved in evaluations, you know that that's not typically how it works. The next slide, please. On the next slide, it looks something more like this, right? You have decision points scattered throughout. You have places where you need to figure out what went wrong. So in the program evaluation piece, are the teachers implementing the program correctly? If the answer is no, you need to figure out why. This could be determined using observations, feedback from professional development, or other means. If they are implementing the program accurately, the answer is yes, then that's great. You go to look and see if they've met the benchmarks and the outcome evaluation piece. If the answer is no, then you have to go back and look at what went wrong and see if you need to revise the program or process. And the same with the outcome evaluation, right? Are the students learning the materials that as intended? Are they showing the necessary improvements, as outlined by the program that you're using? Did they meet the benchmarks? If the answer to meeting the benchmarks is yes, then great, you can start all over again. You could change the benchmark. You could maybe increase the benchmark by 5% each year. And by benchmark, we mean the measure or the indicator by which you've decided that will be the point in which you can say that your project is working. If you're using standardized tests, it could be from being, below to proficient on a reading exam. It could be scoring, going from a average of 65 to an average of 75. Those are your benchmarks. So next slide. So I want to take a minute and pause and see if there are any questions from anybody.
If anybody has any questions, please kindly drop those in either the chat box or the Q&A. As of
I
right
know
now,
that people have come in late because the keynote speaker was going. So if folks have any questions that they may have missed from the introduction, please let me know. I'm happy to answer them again.
as of right now, there are no questions, but I will keep an eye out, Melissa.
Either I'm doing really well, or really, really badly. So that's usually not a good sign. Anyway, so I wanted to take a minute and move on to give some background on Native American perspectives on evaluation. If you could move to the next slide. So typically Western style evaluation is performed, and there is a long and sensitive sordid history associated with this without consideration of Native American values. This is akin to colonialism. The Western evaluator will come in, as I'm sure some of you may have experienced, and declare that, these are the findings and that they own the findings and they own the data, and that this is the result, and this is, you get what you pay for. So as Velez et al. Noted, inherent in Western methodology is the power dynamic between the evaluator and the evaluated. The evaluators own the process, they own the data, they own the knowledge and the intellectual property. Whereas Indigenous evaluation is grounded in being caretakers and not owners of the data and knowledge, and is founded in relational and not transactional constructs. Next slide. So I know Joan LaFrance spoke to the group last year, and I'm fairly jealous that I missed that. So I hope it was edifying and interesting. But since her and Dr. Nichols' work in the early 2000s, there's been a growing field of Native American evaluation theory and evaluation practice that has emerged in education and public health primarily. So LaFrance and Nichols, working together along with tribal colleges and universities, developed an evaluation framework grounded in Indigenous epistemologies that are responsive to cultural values and designed to be embraced by the community. So their work formed the basis of what is now known as the Indigenous Evaluation Framework. Next slide. So the Indigenous Evaluation Framework reflects Indigenous ways of knowing to improve community-led efforts, where community and context are key drivers during the evaluation. It seeks to marry both Indigenous and Western evaluation theory in an effort to remove the colonialism and patriarchy inherent in Western evaluations. So as I think we're all aware, there are many good reasons for Indigenous communities to be wary of Western style evaluations. And LaFrance and Nichols noted that the close connection between research and evaluation can be problematic to many American Indian and Alaskan Natives whose tribes and families have suffered from a long history of intrusive studies that serve to build the reputation of anthropologists and other researchers, while bringing little to Indian communities, and have actually resulted many times in cultural exploitation and the loss of property rights. The Seven Nations group out of the University of Washington refers to this Indigenous evaluation framework, the combination of Indigenous and Western evaluation theories, as two-eyed seeing, where you're learning with both one eye on Indigenous knowledge and with the other on the strengths of Western evaluation practice, working in concert together. So if you could move to the next slide. So as you can see, we took the cycle that we had looked at before, where the, asking questions, organizing the evaluation. 7 Nations translated that into the Indigenous evaluation framework, where phase 1, instead of asking questions and organizing the evaluation, is envision and change. This may include, having a tribal visioning set, a tribal visioning session, or it may include developing success measures that are important to the community and not just important to the people who are giving the program. Phase 2, instead of designing measurements and indicators, you would include not knowledge gathering as a group. You would adjust your plan as you go. As you can see in the 7 Nations Indigenous Evaluation Framework model, that there's space for reflection throughout. That at every point you should be looking back and talking with your community and talking with, tribal councils and others in your community about what is happening in the evaluation, what is happening in the program. You may need to adjust one way or the other. And then as to carry out the evaluation, to assess progress, you may want to use more commonly held Indigenous forms of knowledge gathering, talking circles, journeys, storytellings. And then finally, to celebrate an act, you're going to want to have a regular reflection with the community, implementing improvements as decided. And so this is far less, I keep saying the word linear in focus, but that's always what seems to come to mind when I think about a Western style evaluation, is that, the person comes in, they take the measurements, they may leave, they don't get to speak to everybody, they don't know the community. They may come back, they'll ask a few more questions or maybe give a survey, they'll take that data, they'll come back and say, this is what's wrong, this is what you need to fix, without having that moment of reflection, without being able to contextualize what it is that's going on. And I could imagine that would be very frustrating for all involved. So if we could go to the next slide. So about Native American, so what 7 Nations did was they adopted, and 7 Nations is, again, out of the University of Washington. They are a public health group. They primarily deal with substance use, but I really find their evaluation framework could work for everybody with a few tweaks. So in terms of tweaks, meaning in terms of contextualizing it to your particular situation, your particular program, your particular tribe. So in terms of, let's see, Indigenous knowledge, owning Indigenous knowledge, caretaking Indigenous knowledge, is that they're examples of ways that evaluation could incorporate this are that the evaluation honors multiple ways of knowing. So it may not be just from a survey. There may be a survey, there may be storytelling, there may be a tribal elder meeting, there may be all these different things, and all of those ways are given equal value within the evaluation. There's no, quantitative data rules everything, which is very common in Western evaluations. So in honoring our gifts, in the evaluation context, would recognize that people enter programs in different places with different skills and different experiences. In contrast, Western evaluation assumes, and I would say in the case of like randomized controlled trials or quasi-experimental designs, mandates a similarity between everybody, between the individuals in an evaluation. So taking that in the context of a classroom intervention, Western evaluation assumes that all the children are entering with the same skill set. They all have similar socioeconomic background. Their parents all have similar education backgrounds. And that controlling for these would lead to everybody having similar results. In contrast, the Indigenous evaluation framework acknowledges that some children would be bringing different skills and experiences to the classroom that may change how they, I hate to say this, but interact with the intervention. I don't hate to say that, that's fine. And the intervention may need to be adapted for those children, and that's okay. That's not a failure of the program or of the intervention or of the evaluation. And then under sovereignty, I know there's a session, this PD meeting about sovereignty and ownership of data. So the Indigenous evaluation framework really talks about ensuring tribal ownership and control of data, that you follow tribal institutional review board processes if you have them. And if you don't have one, think about setting one up. If you don't have a responsible conduct of research program when you're working with evaluators, there are many resources. Feel free, and also feel free to reach out to me or OIE if you'd like some of those. We can send you to some websites and other things that talk about this. And reporting in ways that are meaningful to tribal audiences as well as funders, not just producing, you know, in a Western evaluation, you write it up as a report. That may not be appropriate for a lot of, in some tribal contexts. It may be more appropriate at the next tribal meeting to have a video presentation and maybe, or play it on the YouTube channel or what have you. It just, I guess my point is that within the context of the Indigenous evaluation framework, it really is important to contextualize both the program and the evaluation methods so that they suit your tribal context. It's not making the program fit the evaluation, it's making the evaluation fit the program. So next slide, please. Any questions? Anybody? Is this all stuff people have heard before? Let me know.
It looks like there are no questions yet, but if anybody has any experiences or
I would love to hear from the people in the audience about if they've conducted evaluations using the Indigenous evaluation framework of their OIE programs. I think that would be great. Or if they've had a bad experience with a Western evaluation or a good experience with a Western evaluator and conducting that type of evaluation. I think that would be, I would love that. Anybody have anything to share? Okay.
I'll bring them up to you, Melissa.
Okay. Yes, as Sarah said, don't be shy. We're nice. We're nice people. Even though I'm from New York, I'm still nice. All right. So logic models. Logic models are essentially an evaluation plan. I think many of you have probably had to produce them for your either for various funders, for your OIE project, maybe to working with your own evaluator. So regardless of the type of evaluation, Western or using the Indigenous evaluation framework or another Indigenous model of evaluation, the logic model is a high-level plan. It lays out for people who, you know, who's involved, what's going to be happening, what do you expect to see in the short term, medium, and long term. Regardless of a type of data collected, it all fits together. So it's sort of like a recipe, right? You have your ingredients, you have your cooking methods, and then at the end, you have what it's supposed to look like when all is said and done. So next slide, please. Sorry, I kept talking over a slide. So next slide. So pieces of a logic model or an evaluation plan, they typically have 5 or 6 pieces. So your inputs are it could be the people, places, and things. It is the people, places, and things involved in an evaluation. Your activities are essentially your intervention. They're called activities because you could have, in a school-based setting, you could have teacher activities, you could have student activities, you might have administration activities that are all part of a single intervention. Your outputs are the results that you can count, right? How many teachers attended professional development? How many students used the curriculum? How many students took the statewide assessment? How many administrators observed the teachers, and how many observations there were? Those things are outputs, right? Your short-term outcomes are your immediate results. Did the program result in higher test scores for Mrs. Smith's classroom versus Mrs. Jones' classroom who didn't have the intervention? Benchmarks are how do you know the project is working? So these are set by, hopefully in context, the evaluator and the project director would work, and the people involved would work together to say what's good enough for us to say that the program was a success. Was it a 5% reduction in the dropout rate? Was it that 60 kids or 60% of the kids who scored below average became proficient on the reading test? Long-term outcomes are things that could be a result of your program. So a long-term outcome could be with people who are reducing the dropout rate. A long-term outcome could be increased enrollment in college and career readiness, rather than just stopping with a high school diploma and having that be it. I see there's a question. So do we want to go to the question?
Yes, so Michelle Parker has asked, how can I articulate to my target audience on evaluation of a project without confusing them? For example, is there anything like a one-page infographic as an example?
Yes, and if you go to the next slide, this might be helpful. So this is a basic logic model. And you can change these pieces, right? So we call them inputs in evaluation world, but you could say key players, right? The key players at Waterfall Elementary are the students and teachers, right? So your activities are going to be your teachers learn the new reading program, teachers and students learn the new reading program, and students take the statewide reading test. So this is your indicator, your benchmark indicator, right? So this is how you're going to know your project is a success. I would have argued that you probably also need a benchmark for the teacher as well, that they maybe score 75% or higher on the post-test in the professional development of the reading program, that observations would show fluency in the reading program. You know, those sorts of measures are also helpful, because if you don't meet the benchmarks, right, then you need to look and see what went wrong. If you, let's say year one, you only get 20% of the needs improvement students in the previous year scoring proficient instead of 40%. So there's a couple different things you can look at. You can look at, did the teachers learn the program successfully, right? Did they repeat in your professional development? Were they showing that they had gained mastery over the new program? The second thing you might want to look at in terms of the classroom environment, were the teachers implementing the program faithfully? Were they using if there's workbooks, were they using the workbooks? Were they explaining what needed to be done as they learned in the professional development, right? And then the last thing is, looking at the students. I mean, we've had a heck of a few years with COVID and climate change and all of these different things. So maybe, year one, you might have had an earthquake and a COVID outbreak that kept the kids home. That could also impact the benchmarks, right? And so if you're looking at this in the logic model, and especially if you're adapting sort of the Indigenous evaluation framework, you would look at your results from year one and do a reflection and be like, okay, what needs to change? Right? Maybe we need a different instructor for the reading program for the teachers because they just weren't connecting. Maybe we need additional professional development activities to make sure that the teachers and students are using the reading program correctly. Maybe we just need a year without COVID shutdowns. I don't know. But it's this meshing that occurs that I think is really great in terms of 7 Nations, like the two-eyed model that I keep coming back to. And then you have your short-term outcomes. Students are reading better, great. Long-term outcomes, because students are reading better, they don't feel as alienated in school. They feel like they get it. They don't feel like everybody thinks they're stupid. So they high school graduation rates increase. Maybe kids who couldn't read, who weren't reading well before are now reading better. Maybe they're like, oh, maybe college is for me. And so rates of a college attendance increase. So those are examples of the long-term outcomes that could be happening. So next slide. So I just want to go a little bit more into depth about inputs and activities. So just a reminder, while the nomenclature may be a little bit different in terms of Indigenous evaluation framework and Western evaluation framework, the essential pieces are the same. You have your inputs, right? You have your human, financial, organization, community resources that you are using to put your program on, to put your program into action. What a program has available to direct towards the activity, right? There may be issues with it. Let's say you're putting on a social emotional learning project and you find that the one school counselor your district had to leave and there aren't the funds to hire another. So you're kind of stuck because you don't have a critical input. Are there substitutions that you might be able to make in the community? Is there a lay person who may be trained in the particular social emotional curriculum who could come in? So really looking at the depth and breadth of what the community has to devote to this program. And so your activities then are the processes, tools, events, technologies, actions. This is the intentional part of the program implementation. This is your intervention. This is what you're using to achieve your intended changes in the short-term and long-term outcomes. Next slide. So outputs. These are the direct products of program activities that you can count, right? So things you can count here. These can include people's levels, survey results, interview focus group results. Now you may be thinking, ooh, focus groups. Those are typically qualitative, right? But when you look at all your focus groups together and you see what the number of people are who are echoing each other, and if you start to get similar answers with each other, you start to get themes that come out. All of those things can be counted and can be considered outputs, right? You don't want to look at each focus group as an individual entity. Rather, they are parts of a whole. And there's both, you can do this manually. If you're doing interviews and focus groups, you can analyze them manually. There is software you could do this that does this automatically. That's pretty helpful. So lots of different options with that. Same with survey results, and things of that nature. So short-term outcomes are what we typically think of. Oh, sorry, next slide. Short-term outcomes are what we typically think of as the results of an intervention. So did the scores improve at all? Are they are fairly time delimited and direct in response to the benchmark. If your benchmark involves student test scores, your short-term outcomes should be based in student test scores. There should be a one-to-one. You should be looking at the test scores overall, and the test scores may move in the short-term outcome, but may not have moved enough to meet the benchmark. So next slide. So measurements can be used in terms of outputs, can be used in terms of short-term outcomes, can be used in terms of benchmarks. So measurements can be qualitative or quantitative. Typically, surveys, tests, assessments are quantitative. Typically, focus groups, talking circles, journey mappings, and interviews are what terms qualitative measures, right? There's a sense that those are more subjective than a survey, a test, or an assessment, because they may not have the reliability and validity that a survey might be. So just a refresher, reliability is that it measures the same thing every time, and validity is that it measures what it says it's going to measure. So if you have 2 + 2 = 4, and that's on a test for a kid, that 2 + 2 = 4. That's not subjective. If you're asking a parent, however, in a focus group, what was your student's reaction to the new disciplinary practices? That's a very subjective measure. Now, they can be quantified, as we talked about before. You can look and see and say, of the 20 parents we talked to in the focus groups, 15 of them felt that the new disciplinary measures were punitive. That doesn't change the nature that the focus groups are essentially qualitative, but it does add perhaps a way to reliably and validly measure your short-term outcomes and whether or not you meet your benchmarks. Next slide. So benchmarks, once again, these tell you how things are going. You can have process benchmarks or indicators, or outcome benchmarks or indicators. So a process benchmark might be, 90% of the teachers are using the techniques advocated in the program. You could assess this using observations, things of that nature. Or you can have outcome benchmarks that, 50% of the kids will read Moby Dick by the time they hit 9th grade. Why that would be your benchmark indicator, I don't know, but it's the first thing that came into my head. So all your benchmarks and indicators should be realistic and achievable. If you're first graders, right, none of them know their letters when they come into kindergarten. And so by the end of kindergarten, they've just learned their letters. It would be unrealistic to think, not impossible, but it could be seen as unrealistic to think that by the end of first grade, they're all going to be reading above grade level. Right? What you want is a realistic and achievable measure. So one way to do this is by looking at what other children in your district or other children who are using the same program are achieving. What is the average gain? If you're looking at an assessment, what is the average gain in a statewide assessment after using this program? So if the average gain for 9th grade Algebra 1 after using this special online program is 5%, the students score 5% higher who use the program than those who don't, setting as your benchmark a 50% goal, that 50% of the kids who use the program will score higher than they did before. That feels a little unrealistic. And you're kind of setting yourself up to fail and setting the program up to fail. So just, it's something to watch out for. We all want to be overachievers. We all want the people involved in the program to be overachievers. And one way to do that is to set realistic and achievable benchmarks, and then people who go above and beyond, and programs that go above and beyond, you're like, wow, they went above and beyond. So next slide, please. This leads us to the long-term outcomes. So these are your end goals, and they may or may not, it's never usually one straight line, right? So a short-term goal would be more kids are reading on grade level in 3rd grade. The long-term goal is more kids attending college. Now, a lot happens between 3rd grade and college, right? But if your kids are reading on grade level in 3rd grade, they're feeling comfortable with the curriculum, they're feeling confident. Hopefully that carries through the tough middle school years and early high school years. And by the end of high school, they're still carrying that confidence with them and attending college. So they're related, but not necessarily a one-to-one correlation. And then finally, next slide, please, sorry. You're always going to have to report to your stakeholders, right? So your stakeholders could be the parents, it could be your tribal leadership, it could be the teachers, it could be the teachers union, it could be the principals, it could be the district staff. It could be OIE. It could be, what you're putting in your APR reports, right? About how your program is doing. So this sheds gathering all the information and telling a story with the information that you had about about the program's progress over the course of a year can shed light on emerging issues and also help garner support from key players. These stakeholder reports don't have to be formal. You could do videos, you could do testimonials, but you could do a written report. It could be an infographic, any number of things, but it should contain information about the key pieces of the intervention, right? So the inputs, the activities of the intervention, the outputs, the short-term outcomes, and the benchmarks at the very least. So next slide, please. So any questions from folks?
Are there any questions? I don't see any in the chat or in the Q&A box. Don't be shy, drop your questions in.
We'll also have plenty of time at the end because we're moving fairly quickly.
If we get any, Melissa, I can bring them up to you.
That would be great. Thank you. I just hope I'm answering. I hope this presentation is just so good that it's answering everybody's questions as we move through it. And there isn't anything people are wondering. So outside evaluators, we should have made this a poll. Just a quick note in the chat, if folks could sort of, or raise your hands or something, how many folks are using outside evaluators for their OIE program?
Oh, we have somebody who is using an outside evaluator.
We have an outside evaluator.
Yeah, somebody
Awesome.
is an outside evaluator.
Great. That's awesome. Thank you. Thanks for speaking up. So next slide, please. So before you hire an outside evaluator, you want to think about what's important to you from the evaluator. So does your evaluator need to understand the context? Do they need experience with the program or intervention activities? Do they need to be from inside the tribe or outside the tribe? So finding the right evaluator, I should say, can be akin to finding the right spouse or life partner, right? So you should think about hopefully what's important to you, what values you share before embarking on the search, which can help create a more beneficial relationship for everybody. And this is by all means not the only thing that you need to think about, but it is just some of the things that you need to think about. You're going to be working with this outside evaluator, ideally closely, and ideally for the length of time that you have this project going. They're going to be asking you questions. They are going to be looking at your data. They are going to be interacting with different people within the context of your program. You should have a level of trust with them that you feel comfortable doing so. Next slide, please. So potential benefits of hiring an outside evaluator. So using one can minimize the appearance of bias, right? You're looking in from the outside. You're not having the teacher who's delivering the program also evaluating how well they're doing. I do understand that in some cases that is unavoidable, but chances are that would lead to a question about the person's impartiality. Outside evaluators may also be better able to see the forest and not just the trees, and can provide, because they're on the outside, right? They can provide critical feedback before the end of the project that can circumvent problems. So for example, if you have an evaluator who is skilled in reading intervention programs and has evaluated a number of these before and goes into a classroom and sees a teacher maybe not following the reading program directly or whatever, they may be able to either report to the teacher themselves or report to the principal, whoever's managing the program in the school, and say, hey, this is what I saw. They may benefit from a few refreshers or things like that, rather than waiting till the end of the program where you have the kids who did not succeed in reading because the teacher wasn't implementing the program correctly. And then finally, next slide. Where can you find an evaluator? So I did want to call out the Indigenous Evaluation Network. They are a new group of evaluators out in Canada, but I believe they work throughout the US and Canada. They are just getting off the ground. They're having their first meeting in winter 2024. Please check them out, particularly the evaluators in the room. Another place to find an outside evaluator is looking at local colleges and universities. Chances are they have both experience working with the tribes in the area, but also may have a background in evaluation. Some universities actually have a evaluation service that you can hire, maybe with the sociology department or with the education department. The American Evaluation Association also has a topical interest group, or a TIG, called Indigenous Peoples in Evaluation. This is an international group. It's not just based in the US. And you may also want to ask other tribal communities that have evaluated that have put on similar programs and have evaluated them, who they used. Often word of mouth is the best reference. So next slide, please. And we are open for questions.
Looks like we have a question in the Q&A box from the pitch. What are some best practices to hold evaluators accountable to timelines?
Oof. I think in our particular situation, it would be reminding them of the federal reporting requirements, such as the APRs, that you are being held to a strict standard of when you need to get these in. And so if they can't accommodate that schedule for whatever reason, they need to be talking with you about that early. much earlier. Like our deadline, you know, the OIE deadlines don't move because the evaluator can't complete the report. And so that puts you and the program in a very difficult position. And so I'm sorry that you're going through that. That I can't imagine how annoying that must be. So, and I think in terms of best practices, it's just communication early and often and clear communication of the deadlines and potentially putting in the contract, you know, I mean, I hate to be so banal, but, you know, withholding funding if they're not getting stuff done on time. And you would do that if your plumber doesn't show up for 3 weeks when they said they're going to, you're not going to pay the plumber. So why would you pay the evaluator?
Good point, Melissa. If anybody has any other questions, please drop them either in the Q&A box or the chat box. We have a little bit more time.
Or raise your hand. We'll take hand raising. Okay, nobody? Does anyone want me to go in more in depth in anything? Was anything not clear?
Elizabeth made the comment, I appreciate having all of this information in one place. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you,
And
Elizabeth.
don't forget that all sessions will go live. You will be able to watch each session at the end of today's meeting. So for example, June 6 sessions are now available to watch today. Tomorrow, today's sessions will be available to watch. So if you missed anything, don't be afraid to watch it again.
Can you go to the next slide? Oh, are we still? Yeah. So hopefully you will stay in touch. I did put my email in the, I believe I put my email, or did I not have my email in the front? If you reach out to the Office of Indian Education, they will reach out to me if you have any additional questions. So I'm happy to answer them. I think there's in the resources, I do believe that there is a list of the sources that I used with URLs or web links where appropriate. So the 7 Nations document, if you want to take a look at that, again, it's meant for substance use programs, but I think could be used for everything. They really have worksheets to help you work through the evaluation process about what's important. I keep talking about it because I was just super impressed. So if anybody's here who's affiliated with that group, thank you. And that I think that's it. So what time does the roundtable start?
Let me click on the handy dandy agenda tab on the website. We want to encourage people to check out the agenda next. At any time that you're confused, what's going on? Go to the agenda. You click on June 7th.
And thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I know there are concurrent sessions today, and so I appreciate you choosing us.
The roundtable sessions, those do start at 3:35 p.m. Eastern Time. And today's color, make sure to click on the roundtables with the red center icon. After roundtables, we would like to encourage you to check out our resources tab, post on the social wall, or join the roundtables, of course. You can join early, hosts won't be there yet, but you can still join and chat. And that's all from me. Melissa, if you have anything else to say.
No, if someone wants to ask me something and not in front of the group, let me know and I'll stay on. I mean, we can keep the Zoom chat open for a minute if someone has something that they don't want to like announce to everybody as people go off. I'm happy to stay on for a minute and talk more. I see people are slowly leaving.
Are we ready to end this session? I believe people are already making their way to maybe
I think people are making their way to the exit. So, all right. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Gordana. Thank you, Capella.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.